Good morning. For those who are joining us, we're just going to wait a few more seconds for give people who are trying to join us via Zoom an opportunity to kind of log in. So we'll get started momentarily. Thank you for your patience. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you this Juneteenth Eve. I'm Dr. Walker, and I have the pleasure of moderating this important discussion, discussing, recognizing Black women's brilliance. So before I get started, I want to just take a few minutes to highlight a few important things. So starting with, obviously, tomorrow is Juneteenth. And for those who are aware or not aware, in 1865, General Granger entered Galveston, Texas with the Union Army and shared with the enslaved Texans there that based on the Emancipation Proclamation, which had been signed 2.5 years prior to that they are now free. Well, it's obviously tomorrow, and recognizing Juneteenth is important. But one thing I do want to note is historically, is while we're celebrating Juneteenth, I would also recommend people take a look at the importance of the Reconstruction Amendments, including the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Obviously, this is it's a great time for members of the Black community because President Biden, as of yesterday, officially made Juneteenth the 11th federal holiday, I believe, and I think it's the first one since '83, since Dr. King's the signing of Dr. King's celebrating his birthday. So that's really important. What I also want to note is that with this, this is going to be a question and answer format with our distinguished panel. And at about 10:50 or so, I'm going to pause and we're going to try to take a few questions and then end exactly at 11 o'clock. Now, I want to note that we may not get the opportunity, we're willing to have an opportunity to take a number of questions, but we'll try to take as many as possible, but we want to be respectful of our panelists' time. So what I'd like to do right now is also on behalf of United to Promote Cultural Awareness, UPCA, which is a UCF and Valencia downtown initiative. Thank you for this, our first annual and hopefully many years to come celebration of Juneteenth. And as many of you are aware, we had a number of activities throughout the week. And this particular panel discussion is a culmination of those activities. And once again, we look forward to having more Juneteenth events over the next several years. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn to our distinguished panelists and begin to introduce each one. I'm going to start off with Dr. Berry, who currently is Vice Provost for Student Learning and Academic Success and Dean and College of Undergraduate Studies at UCF. Dr. Berry, welcome.
Good morning and welcome to everyone.
Next, I would like to welcome Dean Keller, who is currently Dean of Florida A&M University College of Law. And she's new to FAMU, and prior to becoming a FAMU, she was the Associate Dean in Academic Affairs at Ohio Northern University. Dean Keller, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's a pleasure. Next, we have Dr. Barton Stubbs, and many of you live in the Orlando area, well aware of her work in the Paramore community. And it's important to note in 2004, she founded the New Image Youth Center and is also an author. And we are very excited to have her this morning. Welcome, Dr. Barton Stubbs.
Thank you so much. Grateful to be here.
It's a pleasure. So as I, for our panelists, I noted just a few minutes ago that, and certainly we didn't plan it this way, but we're excited that Juneteenth is now a national holiday. And as I said a few minutes ago, I believe the 11th federal holiday. And so yesterday, President Biden signed the bill with many members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And he also was one other person that was with him. And I don't know if you saw the news, someone by the name of Opal Lee, right? So for people who are watching who don't know who Opal Lee is, she essentially been given the moniker as the grandmother of Juneteenth. So she's 94 years old. And in 2016, I believe, she walked from Texas to Washington, D.C. to advocate for for Juneteenth becoming a national holiday. Now, she's 94, and that was only 5 years ago. She was 89 years old. So to highlight this, to emphasize her commitment to the nation recognizing this as a federal holiday. And so to our panelists, a kind of a twofold question. First of all, like I said, it's a federal holiday. What does Juneteenth mean to you? And then secondly, since we're talking about Black women and all your hard work and experience and success, secondly, can you talk specifically about Black women like Opal Lee, who've been doing the work for so many years and often time forgets them and they're not recognized. So talk about the importance of Juneteenth to you. And then secondly, talk about what Black women like Opal Lee mean to the Black community in America. And so I'm going to start with Dr. Berry, please.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. And so to answer your question, I think, first of all, it's important to recognize the fact that Black women have been instrumental in many of the causes that the folks in the American African diaspora have been striving for centuries, and have been placed in positions where they could be instrumental in helping the Black community acquire many of the rights and privileges that were not only due to us, but that we had earned over the course of many years. But the stories, as you've mentioned, have gotten lost for a variety of different reasons. And sometimes it's because much of what we engage in the Black community has an oral tradition. And that oral tradition, while valuable, leaves opportunities for information to get lost. And it's rather unfortunate that we rely so heavily on ensuring that that tradition carries on. And that comes from our roots on the African continent, where many of the tribes and clans and families and communities and villages engaged in sharing information in an oral tradition. And so we carried that with us coming to this particular country. But because we are now in a space where the oral tradition isn't valued the same way, information unfortunately gets lost. But the value of Black women in relationship to this kind of work has been going on for centuries. Why now? Why is it that we are seeing the face of Black women in the forefront of many of the things that are being accomplished? I would attribute that in part to social media, where there are things that have given us an opportunity to see what's happening locally, to have the opportunity to become national in ways that traditional media had the opportunity to filter that information out. And lean on the tradition of men being the voice of many communities, regardless of race. And there are many people locally, regionally, nationally who have contributed to the causes of the Black community, and many women who have been instrumental in that. But now we have an opportunity through social media to really see how that's happening in real time, and now having those moments integrated into history.
Thank you for that. I think that your point about the oral tradition in the Black community is really important. And once again, it predates our, being brought here in the United States. And I think that's really important. And the role of the griot, right? A griot, a storyteller, right? And maintaining those oral traditions. So thank you for sharing that. Dean Keller, what are your thoughts about the question I posed?
Sure, I'll add a couple of things here. First, I want to underscore what Dr. Berry said about the role that Black women have played in movements for Black liberation in America, but also for liberation writ large, right? So it was Fannie Lou Hamer who said, none of us are free until all of us are free. And so Black women have played an instrumental role, yes, in the civil rights movement, yes, in the abolition movement, all of that, but also in the movement for women's suffrage, right? A movement that was all encompassing, not only for the liberation, like I said, of Black folks, but of women as well. And so we've been central, Black women have been central to all of those movements, even if history has sort of forgotten that bit, right? But, think about the Ain't I a Woman speech, right? So goes way back to the beginning of the suffragist movement. And, that is a Black woman speaking for not just the liberation of Black people, but recognizing that all of our freedom is bound up together, right? And I think Black women, because we sit at that intersection of two very particular kinds of oppression in America, we've always understood, right? If women are left behind, we're going to get left behind. If Black folks are left behind, we're going to get left behind. We don't get to pick, right? Today, I'm for the liberation of Black people. Tomorrow, I'll be up for the liberation of women. Every day, we have to be for the liberation of both. And so I think that's an important aspect of the conversation we're having as well.
Yeah, I think those are great points. Thank you for sharing that. Right. So this idea of, the fight for, racial and gender justice, right? They're intertwined, right? And you particularly mentioned, I know Black men, right? So Black men historically, men in general are placed to the forefront, but particularly the civil rights movement, Black women did the work, right? Think about founding a SNCC and these various other entities. There were Black women, SCLC. There were Black women who helped conceptualize those ideas and were there doing the work. And prior to the civil rights movement for years prior to that. So I think that's really important. And so Dr. Barton Stubbs to kind of, continue this dialogue about what, Juneteenth and then the women, like I said, Black women in terms of particularly Opal Lee yesterday being there at 94 years old, finally, after more than a century on this planet, finally having her dream fulfilled. So you talk a little bit about that for us, please.
Definitely. So I appreciate, again, being on the panel, especially amongst such amazing Black women. And so when I am hearing a lot of what they're sharing today, so in this moment, I would just say in the last 2 years, I've just become very transparent with my journey. And I was the one that was raised, and I always attended schools where I was the minority in the school and so forth. So I'm just starting to identify who the heck Shantae Barton Stubbs is and not being afraid of sharing that. And I say that because when we think about the brilliance of Black women, and while we have not necessarily seen them receive the recognition or even the attention that they deserve, it's because for so long there was a society that I was raised in that was telling me that I had to hush. I needed to be quiet. Number one, I come from the church background. My parents are pastors. And so women, we were able to speak up, but then there was always a place. You didn't put yourself out there too much. And then number two, been in an environment where in the school systems I was in did not support who I was, I felt less than. So even when I did accomplish something, I did not want to necessarily boast about it or really share about it because I knew that it was going to be overshadowed by something else. And I think this is what we've seen in the past for so many years with our Black women who have done absolutely amazing things. It has always been overshadowed by something else, or we didn't have the confidence or even other people just pushing us to the forefront to be able to receive that recognition. So when I think about Juneteenth, especially now with it being passed as a federal holiday, let me say this. I am just learning about Juneteenth within the last maybe 10 years. So this was not something that I was taught. I know I see Dr. Berry's eyes are like, but really, this is not something that I was taught. It was not something that was shared with me. My parents believed in just the holiness of God, and that was kind of all I was taught. And Black history was not just a big thing. And so I am learning this process, and because I am helping lead the next generation, I am learning it with them, but I'm also being very vulnerable to let them know, hey, guess what? We're learning this together, but it is our responsibility to highlight these amazing women who have came before us, who have done amazing things, who've been fighting to get to where we are at this point. So this Juneteenth is definitely a moment of freedom, of being able to finally be okay with who you are and not apologizing for what you have done and what you actually bring to the table.
Thank you for that, Dr. Barton Stubbs, and I appreciate your transparency. I know we all do. And I know, I think you were making a comment about Dr. Berry. I think she was thinking probably, and I'm not speaking for a letter comment, that this is not, what you described is not uncommon. Yeah. We just had the commemorated the 100th anniversary of Tulsa, right? What, about a week or two ago? And there are people in Oklahoma that didn't even know anything about it, right? So we can talk about here in Florida, Rosewood and the Cody massacres, right? Mm-hmm. Just recently, the state legislator, and there's more conversation about those massacres. And it's important to note that that all happened within a period of time around the red summer of 1919, all within a couple of years of each other. So it's certainly, like I said, recognizing there are a lot of members of the Black community and Americans in general that don't know anything. They didn't know anything about Juneteenth. And some hadn't heard about it until yesterday, until they saw, the news, local and national news. So you are not alone. And that's why in this debate about issues relating to race is important, and particularly the experiences of Black women, right? Because in terms of, like I said, you deal with challenges from multiple perspectives. Dr. Berry, you wanted to share something?
Sure, absolutely. And I wanted to let Dr. Barton Stubbs know she's not alone in that. I did not learn about Juneteenth in school as well. And I sort of wanted to attribute that to the fact that I grew up in Philadelphia, and we didn't celebrate Juneteenth when I was growing up at all. And what I was taught in school was always about the ways in which the city and the state were very abolitionist in nature because of the Quakers and the state law that was passed that abolished slavery, in Pennsylvania being the first place in the country when it was still a colony that abolished slavery. And so we all walked around thinking we had it all together, right? Because we did all these great, wonderful things. But but as a result of putting forward that history to us in school, and about, for instance, one of the interesting pieces that we learned in school was the fact that embedded in the law that abolished slavery was a clause in this particular Pennsylvania legislation that also said that if an enslaved person had lived in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months, they would then be emancipated, right? And so, and as a result, one of the things that many of our founding fathers did, who had homes in Virginia, who had to come to Pennsylvania to do business, they deliberately left on month 5 to ensure that their enslaved people who traveled with them would not be emancipated, right? Yeah. So this is part of the reason why when you go to Philadelphia, you'll see about a dozen houses that say George Washington slept here, right? Because he was avoiding having to emancipate the people that he had enslaved that traveled with him. So he couldn't stay in the same place all the time. Right? So, but as a result of putting forth that history, things like Juneteenth were put in the back burner because we were led to believe that was those people who had to suffer that. That wasn't us, right? And that kind of silencing really positions the way in which we understand the events that impacted on all of us.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. So I want to talk a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit about the last, 2 years or so, right? So there was Stacey Abrams was nominated for, a Nobel Peace Prize. Obviously, Vice President Harris' ascension, over the last year, first Black woman ever be elected Vice President of the United States. And there's also Black women who become CEO of corporations. And obviously, all three of you are examples of, once again, the ascension of Black women in America. But why is it taking so long for the United States to recognize Black women's brilliance? Dean Keller, I want to start with you first.
Sure. I'll say something that picks up on what Dr. Berry was just talking about, right? Which is how we educate people about Black history, how the American educational system educates folks about Black history. And I think, Juneteenth is kind of a perfect example of this, because I didn't learn about it either. Growing up in New York, didn't learn anything about Juneteenth. And really, when you think about how we're taught the history of African Americans, it's really kind of summary teaching, right, in the K-12 system. And so you get kind of the highlights, right? There was slavery, and then there was the Emancipation Proclamation, and then there was Dr. King, and that's kind of the gist of it. And there's really so much more than that. And Juneteenth, the reason I'm saying that's a perfect example is because, people think slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. It most certainly did not, right? Even on its face, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't end slavery. What the Emancipation Proclamation did was free slaves in rebel states, right? And really for the purpose of reinforcing the Union Army, right? So we will free you as we come so you can join our ranks and help us fight the fight. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation did, but I didn't learn that in my K-12 education. I didn't learn it in my undergraduate education. I learned it really on my own pursuing graduate studies. And so, Juneteenth points out, like, very specifically, that emancipation wasn't a moment, it was a process, right? Because the first Juneteenth comes 2+ years after the Emancipation Proclamation, but that's when folks in Galveston, Texas came to learn that they were free, right? That's when enslaved folks in Galveston came to learn that they were free. And so it's really important to have this nuance, right? Because we have this sense of history that is, the highlights, the almost the soundbite version, and that's just not comprehensive. And so to bring that back to the question you just asked about why it has taken so long for Black women to be recognized as leaders, right? Because we've already talked about how Black women have long been leading. I think part of it is about how we tell the stories of leadership in America, right? And so our narratives of leadership are, as a general proposition, male focused. And so that lands on Black women in a particular way, because our narratives of history are also primarily white. And so that, yes, Black women then get lost in the nuance. And the last thing that I will add about this is I do think we're in a moment where we're going to see, and we are seeing, many more Black women highlighted as leaders, right? And so I am one of 22 Black women who lead law colleges right now. That is phenomenal and wonderful. It's wonderful to serve in this space amongst those fantastic colleagues. But 10% of the law schools in this country are now led by Black women. And it's a little bit crazy that it took this long for us to get here, but it's great that we are here.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And, there's been a lot of discussion in higher ed about percentages of Black women on college campuses recently. There's a Chronicle Higher Education article that highlighted some challenges relating to Black women and working in post-secondary institutions. Dr. Barton Stubbs, I want to go back to you and as it relates to this question, right? I mentioned Stacey Abrams, Vice President Harris, and like I said, there are a few Black women that come recently within the last few months, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And like I said, once again, all three of you are an example of Black excellence. So can you talk a little bit about what is it? Why is it taking so long for society to recognize that Black women are brilliant?
Definitely, I would have to echo what Dr. Berry and Dean Keller has already shared. Listening, and I was just thinking about that question. I think it's in the way that the stories have been told. How we getting the information, who's telling the stories. And I just think for a very long time, as a culture, I don't know if we necessarily have unified to come together to push our stories out there. If we're not the ones at the top telling the stories all the time, then it's going to be told in a manner that's maybe not 100% the truth or not highlighting who we are as the essence. And so I think what we're seeing now is just a new generation of millennials coming up, and then even some of who we are now, of just being able to say, you know what, it is my responsibility to tell the narrative, to tell the story the way that I see it. I just don't know if many of us have had that voice wherein we were able to reach the masses of being able to share the brilliance of Black women and their leadership and what's taking place behind the closed doors. So I can't even say personally that I've had the opportunity to even study or even to find out. So even listening to the stats that Dean Keller just shared, I think that's absolutely phenomenal to know that over 10% of African American women are over HBCUs and colleges. I think I wouldn't have never known that. And I'm immediately began to think, where do I find that information? So I just think although we do have social media, I think it's just important for Black women in leadership for us to make sure that we are telling the story, we are telling the narrative the way that it needs to be told so that people are learning. I think we also have to remember to be always open. I always tell people that no matter what my age, no matter what my educational level, I'm always a student. So I'm always willing to learn. So even listening today from Dr. Berry and Dean Keller, I'm learning information that I had never even knew before. So when we open up ourselves and understanding that we're always a student, we always have the ability to learn so that we can listen to the younger generation. They may have a better way to put the information out. They may have a better way of us being able to be highlighted in the manner that we need to. But I think we also should just as leaders make sure that we're taking that responsibility to put that information out. Because if we don't, then it's going to continue to be done in the same manner that has been done for years. And the story is totally different from my personal experience. I've heard it totally different. So very grateful again for the information that I'm even just learning today, because I don't hear this all the time. But sitting on this panel and hearing this, it gives me, I kind of begin to exude excellence in a way that makes me feel even more prouder of who I am and where we're going in this process.
Thank you for the insight, Dr. Barton Stubbs. And like I said, all three of you here because you do epitomize Black excellence and brilliance. So that's why we're very proud to have you, all three of you here on this panel today. And thank you for your insight. Dr. Berry, I want to go to you about the same question relating to what has taken society so long. And like I said, I highlighted two examples, but I could keep going down the line for generations. What has taken society so long to recognize Black women's brilliance?
I think the point around who is telling the story, right? And so I'm a curriculum scholar by training and a philosopher. And there's a key scholar in curriculum studies by the name of Herbert Spencer, who asked two very important questions. The first is, what knowledge is most worth knowing? The second, who determines what knowledge is most worth knowing? And it is that second question that really sort of moves us into what we know and how we know what we know. And part of what has happened is that, it sort of goes back to an old African proverb, that the victor gets to tell the story. The story always comes from the perspective of the lion and not the lamb, right? And as a result, we have the victors or the perceived victors always telling the story from their perspective, which means that they position themselves in a favorable light, which oftentimes, intentional or unintentional, other stories or other versions of the stories get silenced. And in doing so, what we have to be faced with is the fact that the people who often get silenced sort of also fit into the social stratification of this country. And I come from a perspective that anything significant that has happened in this country, and probably in various other parts of the world, have Black women involved in it. And that if we fail to tell the story that includes us, there are likely lots of other people who are not included in the story as well. I have had the good fortune of having really good teachers and really good role models who have shared with me their involvement or perspectives in relationship to Black women. But if I had not had those individuals to tell me those things, my work would not be centered on the ways in which Black women's voices enhance the stories that we think we know in relationship to every significant moment in American history. And so I think the silencing comes from the fact that it's always the victor or the person who that is the perceived victor that is getting to tell their story, and leaving subsequently our stories silenced. I also want to comment that when we think about this notion of Black women's brilliance and our stories being told, I think it's important to recognize that we share information within our community, and we get connected to each other in ways that help us to serve our community better. And Dr. Keller and I are removed by one degree of separation. She commented on the fact that I think there are 22 college law deans, and one of them happens to be my maternal first cousin, who knows Dr. Keller and happened to mention to me, "You're going to be having a conversation with my good friend in a couple of days." I was like, "Okay, I'll try to remember to mention that." So, but this is how we get our stories told, by sharing with each other.
Yeah, and thank you for that. So I think collectively in all your points you're making, and certainly Dr. Berry, everyone talked about this idea about narrative, right? Who's telling this story, right? And there's that saying to the victor goes the spoils, kind of, right? This idea of narrative. And this is something we're dealing with right now as a nation, struggling with a nation, is narrative, stories, and honesty, right? Being truthful and understanding pain. That there have been groups that have suffered extreme pain in this society. And how do we discuss that? And how do we address the issues that have come as a result? Some of the Jim Crow after Reconstruction, right? Or the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander has described. So what I want to go to now is something really important, is that, so over the last couple of years, the hashtag Black Girl Magic, I see it everywhere, and I still see it. I don't see it as much as I used to, but there have been a number of initiatives and nonprofits, et cetera, that kind of have received money because they're focused on STEM, or whether it's law or nonprofit organizations like Dr. Barton Stubbs runs. So this hashtag Black Girl Magic, also I've been amazed when for the Black women in my life, in terms of when that hashtag came out and their response to social media, is it how it changes the way they feel in that moment, right? So I want to start with Dr. Barton Stubbs, and I want to talk about that hashtag Black Girl Magic. Has that changed the way in which people celebrate Black women?
I personally believe that it has. Again, you have to remember a little bit of how I was raised and the school system and things that I went through, wherein Black girls were not celebrated. Black girls magic did not exist. It not necessarily even the words, but even the attitude and how people treated Black women or Black children and so forth. So when I start hearing that was just not too long ago, and I was here learning the process of philanthropy work through New Image Youth Center, it began to assist me in understanding that it was my responsibility to be able to highlight more of that Black girl, Black boy magic, being able to identify those special traits and talents that all of our children had, and letting them know, no, this is what makes you magical. This is what makes you special. This is what helps you to stand out. And I think that just seeing that whole hashtag and the whole movement begin to come alive just was a learning experience for me, and I'm sure so many others, of knowing that, no, hey, we are that. We create magic. The things that we do, it does not just happen. Even down to things when you think about the culture here in the Paramore community where I am, we think about like dancing is a big thing, right? And parties and certain things, the talents that the community has not often been looked, at or even like highlighted. But then now people are really ready to give the world who they are. And I think that whole hashtag Black Girls Magic, Black Boy Magic, or just giving that attention to who we are as a community has really begun to just heighten us all in knowing that, oh, this is my gift, this is my talent, and I can offer it to the world. And I don't have to worry about who's going to say what, or if it's acceptable, or if it's allowed. And I say acceptable because a lot of things that I had the ability to do, I did not do as a child, and even as a leader here in the not-for-profit sector. My whole goal was to make sure that I was being respectful to those who who were donating or helping me keep the mission alive. And sometimes most of the time, let's just be honest, it wasn't people that looked like me. And so I would somewhat, what we would say, water down who we were to make sure that we were not too much for the ones who were keeping us going. So hearing that slogan, Black Girls Magics, just assisted me in understanding, no, but this makes you who you are. This is why you're considered the good in the hood, because of this magic. And it just kind of gave us that attitude of being able to be a little bit more of who we are, and not, of course, dimming our own light, but also not allowing anyone else to dim our light because of who we were, because what the whole world was promoting, no, you are magical. You have these gifts, you have these talents, and you're giving it to the world in a way that we need to see it. And I think that was the encouragement that I needed, that I needed to see so that I can hand it down to the next generation, but also to lead the community in understanding, no, that's your magic. Let's use it.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Berry, your thoughts about that hashtag Black Girl Magic and what it means for you?
So I'm sort of feeling a wee bit schizophrenic about it, if I might say, because on the one hand, it was very sort of life affirming, like, yes, I am seen, I am visible, and my efforts and my hard work are visible to folks as well. But on the other side of that, I thought to myself, this isn't really magical. This is about enduring a lot of things, putting in a lot of hard work, and having a lot of support to get to this point, to be able to do the work, the research, the scholarship, et cetera, and to be able to do it at a level that it couldn't be ignored. So it was really sort of disorienting to be excited about being visible in that way, but having it be seen as something that just happens, like it's. And so, yes, I want to acknowledge that we have these talents and gifts and all kinds of ways in which we engage in our work that come from some experiences that we have outside of the educational realm, that come from support from family members and ancestors and all of those things. But at the same time, that there is real work done, that this notion of magic, so to speak, didn't just happen or didn't just come from being talented, right? So, and I think some of that started to seep into the public curriculum space, into the social media, which might be why we don't see it as often as we used to. But by the same token, I think there is something to be said for the fact that there's real recognition in what's happening and who's doing it.
And thank you for that point, because maybe also we talked about the narrative, right? So we talked about that earlier, particularly, Black women being in control of their own narrative, right? So that hashtag was created by Black women for Black women, right? But I think your point is an excellent one in terms of recognizing this affirming phrase, but at the same time, all the work and the challenges that Black women have to navigate, even, and then also what Dr. Bart Stubbs is getting to is, in some ways, these phrases being co-opted, right, or being adopted by different groups, and then shifted in a way that doesn't quite represent Black girl magic anymore. And then I want to go to Dean Keller. Dean Keller, your thoughts about the phrase Black girl magic and what it means.
Yeah, so I'll pick up on a couple of threads from my co-panelists. The first is Dr. Berry talks appropriately about resilience, right, and doing the work. And the thing that I'll add here in terms of Black Girl Magic is vision, right? So I think part of what that hashtag embodies for me is a recognition that Black women, and this gets us back to the leadership point, right, come to the table with a vision for a better world, for liberatory possibilities, right? And so I want to put that on the table. And then the other, like Dr. Berry, I feel a little bit torn about this, right? Because the magic, it has a cost, right? It's not free, we didn't get to resilience without trauma, right? We didn't get here without not just work, but pain. And so the magic is, there's a cost behind it that I think we have to recognize. So yes, we might be magic, but we're also human. And so we don't want the perception um, of Black women being magical to take over our humanity, right? And so that's the piece of it that I'll gift back, right? But then to pick up on Dr. Barton Stubbs' comments, what I'll say is what's kind of underlying Dr. Barton Stubbs' comments about bringing your whole self to your work is a sense of joy, right? And so part of the magic is finding the joy in doing this work, right? In uplifting communities, in moving the needle on racial progress, in all of the ways that that we dedicate our work to doing those things, right? And in bringing your whole self, like Dr. Barton Stubbs talked about dance, right? And that is first and foremost an expression of joy. And so I want to just make sure that as we're talking about what is magical about us, part of what we're emphasizing and keeping within that frame is that joy.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Dean Keller. And before we move on to the next question, I just want to let our audience know that if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. Like I said, I do want to be mindful of our guest time and want to try to get in one or two questions from the individuals who are joining us. And once again, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule this morning, this Juneteenth Eve, to join this in discussion, celebrating Black women's brilliance with our excellent trio of guests. So I want to go to a question, and the Olympics is happening this summer. Actually, a few weeks ago, I didn't realize, but and I know we didn't have I guess it was scheduled for last year, and it is a question relating to brilliance in relation to Black women. So Simone Biles, who I think everyone recognizes as the greatest gymnast of all time, right? Who's undoubtedly won more gold medals in this summer. She's the only, essentially the only gymnast who's capable of performing the Yurchenko double pike. Now, I don't have any experience in gymnastics, but I try my best to pronounce that. So if I slaughtered it, please don't think ill of me, okay? So I did my best. So she's the only one essentially this particular move that she can, initiate. And so I've had conversations with Black men about this particular topic, and I think a few op-eds have been written about it. And then some Black women I've talked to and I've read in some of the writings, and because she gets low scores for it, right? So no one else can do this move, but she's penalized essentially and given low scores. So one of the concerns I've heard from Black women I've talked to is that this is another example, and we're talking about obviously celebrating Black women's brilliance, in which Black women, in terms of their talents, their ability to be exceptional and certain tasks, certain abilities that maybe no one else can have, or no one can meet that level of excellence, being penalized. And it made me think about the workplace in my conversations I hear about Black women, about the challenges in terms of they're being exceptional in the workplace and in being held to a different standard. So I want to talk to you about that. As Simone Biles, how she's this particular routine, she doesn't receive low scores. Do you think in some ways this kind of reflects the challenges that Black women encounter in the workplace? And I want to go with, start with Dr. Berry.
I think those challenges exist for Black women in pretty much every venue. And when I was looking at this question, it reminded me of the Black female figure skater, Soraya Bonali, out of France, who can do this move where she can do a backflip and land on one blade. No one else can do it, and she gets penalized for it every time, right? And we've seen this happen in other venues where Black women are excelling in a particular arena and can do some particular thing well, but somehow get penalized for it. So we know the story of the young girl, a teenager who played softball, got on Good Morning America out of the Chicago area, and wanted to be able to be on a college team and playing with men, and got penalized for it. There was another young Black woman who, as a young child, was playing football but couldn't get onto a collegiate football team. So we see all these things happening, and they are a microcosm of the kinds of things that Black women experience in general, that sometimes we are penalized for the hard work, the effort, and the gifts and talents that we bring into a space, along with our passion for what we're doing, because it is considered unheard of or unseen before. And it's really a double standard, because when other people do it, it's groundbreaking, it's phenomenal, it's extraordinary, and everyone's trying to replicate it. So what is it about the idea of Black women engaging in these kinds of practices that seems to earn sort of a poor standing or a poor situation for us? And that's a mystery to me, to be quite honest. I'm not sure I can answer that question from a singular point of view and ascribe that to a general situation. But it is a common situation. It's a common occurrence. And it would be interesting and certainly worthwhile to see what kinds of attributes occur that all these situations have in common, in order to then ascribe this to a particular theoretical phenomenon that we can place in general to Black women. So it's disheartening, but it doesn't necessarily keep us from striving forward and continuing to do our best.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think one interesting thing about some of us in terms of response to this kind of treatment is, I just saw that when she was last, I guess it was the US Olympic trials, and she had stitched in a goat. For those who don't know, the GOAT, the acronym, greatest of all time. So, and when we talk about Black girl magic and the response to challenges, I always commend Black women, because that is, she didn't say anything, but having the goat stitched into her guitar spoke volumes, and people saw what it meant. So next, let's go to Dean Keller. That same question about this, with the challenges Simone Biles is dealing with, and does it kind of reflect the challenges that Black women encounter in the workplace?
Sure. So to kind of take this out of the realm of sports for a little bit, in my other life, I'm a copyright scholar, so I write about copyright. And this phenomenon that you're noting has like historical antecedents in that space, right? So I think of like Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote the first known book of poetry by a Black woman in the Americas. And no one believed that she had written that work, right? It was unimaginable to folks that she was the author of that work. And of course, at the time that she was doing it, in much of America, it was illegal for Black people to read and write. And so that was part of it. Like, how did you get past this barrier that we have put in place for you? And then on top of that, imagining a Black woman as an author just beyond people's capacity to imagine, right? And so I think that's part of it. It's that we have this image in our heads of who is, a phenomenal athlete, of who is an author, of who is exceptional. And, Black women don't generally, that's not what comes to mind for a lot of people. And so when you have Black women being exceptional in the world, it's like, well, this is an anomaly. How do I explain this anomaly, right? But we know it's not an anomaly, right? I mean, within our communities, we know that there's nothing anomalous about that. And so I think that's part of it. It's that, and in a way, we're back to the narrative question, right? But you have an image in your head of what a great author looks like. My favorite author, Toni Morrison, talked about this all the time, right? Because she was constantly getting questions about like, when are you gonna like break out of writing about Black people? And she was like, would you ever ask a white author that? No, right? Like the fact that I am writing about my community and that I'm recognized as one of the best authors in the world for doing that shouldn't be seen as bizarre, right? And so I think that's part of it. To bring it back though to how that shows up in the workplace, I really think that you're in this sort of double bind, right? Where again, the expectation is not that you are going to excel, right? And so then when you do, then folks try to well, how? Like they try to explain it to themselves with a narrative that they're comfortable with. Um, and so you're constantly kind of struggling against that, right? And to get back to something Dr. Barton Stubbs said earlier, you're also kind of editing yourself to make sure that you're not running up against some of these stereotypes, right? So a lot of times, when I practiced law in my life before academia, people would say, well, be assertive. And I would say, well, if I'm a man and I'm assertive, then I'm assertive. But if I'm a woman, and especially a Black woman and assertive, there's a whole different word, right, that we're not going to say on this panel that's ascribed to me. And so you're constantly kind of struggling against that as well. So I think we have to be mindful of those things, but also not let them contain us.
Thank you for sharing that. I promised that we would stop at 10:50 to take some questions. So it looks like we're only going to get one question. I'm actually going to start with you, Dr. Barton Stubbs, but I'm going to read this one question. We have about 7 minutes. So if you each panelist can respond in about 2 minutes, and then I'll close. So Dr. Barton Stubbs, someone who's watching this question is, as Black women in their current, your workplace in terms of what you do, what are some of the unique challenges that you encounter as a Black woman? And Dr. Barton Stubbs, we'll start with you. What are some of the unique challenges you encounter as a Black woman? About 2 minutes.
So I don't know if they're necessarily unique because I'm sure other people kind of encounter some of the same things. But in the process of me running New Image Youth Center, I am also a licensed therapist. And so that's my career, that's my job, that's my focus. And I primarily work with children. And recently I became a play therapist. And so I would say one of the challenges has been, number one, being able to introduce play therapy or even therapy in general to my community, allowing people to understand that I know that you've saw therapy in a certain light on television, and it has always kind of been diminished or the thing that you don't do because you don't want to be labeled, but just being able to share that therapy is something that we all could use, and being very creative in how I bring therapy to a community such as Paramore. And so other unique challenges, of course, has been, as I shared earlier, with New Image Youth Center, I was going along with the ones who were here to support us. And not all the time were they African-American individuals. Sometimes they were not. And I would have to try to find my balance and remember what the core mission was so that I would not straddle the fence. And I would be very attentive to who and why I was here to serve. Who was I here to serve was the community. What were they wanting or needing me to say when I had seats at the table? So definitely identifying that this mission necessarily is not about me at all, but it's about who I am serving. And they may not all have an opportunity to be in the places that I am, but I always want to make sure that I'm representing. But sometimes that can be very daunting, depending on where you are and who you're around and what they're telling you to say for a donation or for a check and so forth. And so just finding and keeping and maintaining the voice that I need for the community has been a challenge at times because, again, this is so out of my comfort zone. I'm the young lady who would always go along with the flow because I wanted to please everyone. So those are my challenges.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Barton Stubbs. Dean Cullum, I'm going to go to you next in a minute or so. Can you share what are some of the challenges you encounter in the workplace as a Black woman?
Sure. So I will say that I have the unique pleasure of serving an HBCU, and it is that it's a very different thing, a much more affirming place than I have worked previously. So all of my prior work experience has been in primarily white institutions. And so this is, I don't really have complaints that are specific to my race or my gender, to be honest, within my current work environment. Prior work environments, I definitely encountered a lot more resistance to folks taking direction from me in particular. I have been in positions where I managed people for 15 years, and in all of that time, really until now, I have encountered, like I said, resistance to folks taking instruction from me, like, why should I listen to you? Well, because you're my direct report, right? So look at this org chart. This is why. That has really been a kind of a breath of fresh air in my current institution, because, you know, Black women leading within primarily Black institutions is not new or different. And so I'm blessed to serve this institution in this moment.
Thank you for sharing that. Dean Barry, well, Vice Provost Barry and Dean Barry, that's both of those, and Dr. Barry. I was wondering if in a minute you could share your, some of the, research-wise, and you're sharing your Black women sharing your lived experiences now, the challenges in the workplace of being, encountered as a Black woman.
So it's interesting because as a person who sort of moves through multiple spaces, there are two challenges that I feel like I face pretty much every day. And the first of which is one that's internal, and how I see myself in greater spaces, and then the one that's external, how other people see me. The internal thing is usually one that I encounter when I'm any place but on campus. When I'm moving through the world, and even though a good part of my identity is wrapped up in my work as a scholar and as an administrator, I know that when I walk into any other space, there's no sign above my head that says, this is a college professor. So as a result, I realize that when I walk into spaces, all people see is what they see. And it's interesting because one of my former students acquired a t-shirt for me that says, don't let what you've learned distort what you see. And I have to remind myself that people will only see me based on what they think they know about Black women in general. And I have to be prepared in some cases to educate people just in the way that I carry myself into certain spaces. The other one is the external one in my identity particularly on campus, is one where I'm always thinking about the ways in which my whole identity informs everything that I do. And so sometimes when I'm in a room, people are surprised that I know certain kinds of things, simply because I have this sort of central identity that people ascribe to me just based on my title, without thinking about, oh, she's done all these other things. And sometimes in those moments, I think to myself, did somebody actually read my CV? Right? But I realized that, that's part of the learning experience of working with new colleagues, and my having the opportunity to get to know them, and them having the opportunity to get to know me. And the more they get to know me, the more people come to understand, oh, now I understand why she's so passionate about X or Y, or why she engages in work in this way, because she's had these kinds of experiences. But without knowing that, people see us as a physicist, or as a curriculum scholar, or as an educational admin scholar, or pick your identity, right? Without understanding that many other things inform how we move through a particular space.
Thank you for sharing that. And as we bring things to a close, I want to thank all three of you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know it's a Friday and Friday morning. You didn't have to accept our invitation. So on behalf of United to Promote Cultural Awareness, UCF and Valencia Downtown, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Vice Provost and Dean Barry, Dean Keller, Dr. Barton Stubbs, we appreciate your work. And, the title Celebrating Black Women's Brilliance was created on purpose to recognize your excellence. And hopefully, this event being sponsored by UPCA is something we hold annually. We look forward to continuing to communicate with you and beginning to get involved in various other activities that we're trying to sponsor in the Central Florida area. And on behalf of the university, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day, afternoon, actually. Good day.